Pouse around the house. Today I'm going to show you how to do an oil change and an oil filter change on a Suzuki DRZ 400. Now in this particular example we've got the SM model or the Supermoto, but the general principle is exactly the same for all models. Now before we start any of the oil change, just turn the engine over, leave it running for about 4 or 5 minutes, ticking over, then turn the engine off and just let it cool down a little bit. So now we're going to undo this guard plate using a 10mm socket like this one. I'm using this short extension as well with a little ratchet. So now looking at the front of the bike again, you can see there's a small nut by there, and this is the first nut we need to release to get rid of some of the old engine oil. Now when you do this, make sure you've got a bowl like this below, because it's all going to spurt out and you don't want it all over the floor. Secondly, make sure this exhaust isn't too hot if you've had the engine running, because obviously you could burn your hands. And thirdly, maybe consider wearing a pair of gloves in case you get oil over yourself. So using a 12mm socket, I'm going to release this and try not to get oil everywhere. And there we go. This should release most of the oil. And another thing to note is, give this nut a really good clean. Now you'll notice there's a washer comes off with the nut that we just took off. If you've got any doubt at all about the condition of that, now is the time to change it. In my example, I'm quite happy with this, so I'm going to put this back in. So I'm happy that the oil stopped coming out, so I'm going to reinsert this nut back into that hole. I'm just going to tighten that up, so that's just gone there about hand tight, and I'm just going to give it one little nip. There we go. You don't want to over tighten that. We'll wait till we put the oil in. If we've got any doubt about leaks later, we can tighten it up then, but don't over tighten it. So back on the side of the engine again, I'm just coming round and underneath, just so I can show you exactly where it is. There's the next secondary nut that we need to remove. In exactly the same way, we'll undo this. Make sure that your bowl is underneath because the oil is going to come out. This time we're using a 14mm socket. And there we go, and that'll be the remaining engine oil. If we take a closer look at that nut, you can see where the magnetic end is. There are a few metal filings on there, obviously that's off the engine, and this is the importance of not only changing the oil, but giving this a good clean. And if we look on here, there's another washer. I'm quite happy with the condition of mine, so I'm going to put this back on the bike. However, if your washer looks like it's a bit tired, then now is the time to change it. So I'm just going to give this a quick clean. So there we go, now I've cleaned that. You can see that magnet just on the end there. That's now lovely and clean. And this washer also is lovely and clean, so that's going to go back in the bike now. But before I do that, I'm just going to tip the bike up to see if any more oil comes out. So there we go, by just tipping that bike I just got a tiny bit more out. Okay, so now we're down to just a couple of drips, so I'm happy with that. This nut's going back in. So again, I've done that up just soft so it's tight, and then just a quick nip like that, nothing too tight, firm as I like to call it. So now it's time to change the oil filter, which is below this. Now if you look on this capping, there's a little arrow there, so you want to make sure that when you put it back the arrow always points up, so it's in this bit, in this direction. These nuts, they're not done up with any sort of pressure, and you've got to be careful as well around here, they're a bit fragile, so when you do them back up after, just don't over tighten them. So for this we need a 10mm socket. Just release that. And again, you want your bowl underneath. So when I start undoing this, the oil's going to start dripping down. And because of the way the bike leaning on the stand on the other side of the bike, it's going to run down its engine. So it is going to cause a bit of mess, unfortunately. But that's just something we're going to have to clean up afterwards. And these, rather than bolts, they're just little nuts that go over these studs. So if you push that tight, you can stop the oil coming over your hands, and then when we do this, there we go, out it comes. Now when you take this off, just be a bit careful, because you'll have a spring in there, should stay in place, just make sure it doesn't come flying out. You should have a rubber O-ring in there. Mine is obviously stuck to the casing, so I'm just going to peel that off to show you now. There we go, it's just sort of stuck with pressure and oil. Now this O-ring, if it's in good nick, you can put it back on. Now I've actually bought a new O-ring. I'm going to replace this, and there's another small little O-ring I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm replacing that as well. Now you've got to be careful when you buy some air filters. They will come with these O-rings. Other ones don't. Now mine didn't, but I bought these parts. I think they're about £1.50 for one, £2 for the other, something like that. So not overly expensive. So for the money, it's probably worth changing them each time you do the oil filter change, but that's entirely up to you. So I'm just going to give this a quick clean first, and then put that to one side. Now this could be a little bit fiddly. There we go. Because I've got nails, I can remove that, but you may need some thin nose pliers. If you take that, we're going to get a bit of oil come out there. So I'm just going to drain that oil off a second, and then I'll show you the filter. And once you've removed your oil filter, you'll see this is the small O-ring I was talking about, and that kind of butts up to this and sits over this protruding part inside this casing. Now is a good time to move your bowl across and tilt your bike, and hopefully more oil is going to pour out of that now. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm just going to clean out any of the old excess oil in there before putting in our new oil filter. Before we continue, I'm just going to clean all the engine casing there. And before I fit these parts, I'll just show you the part numbers that I've got. I got these from a Honda dealer, but they're meant to be genuine parts. So we've got that one, which is the small O-ring, my large O-ring, there's some part numbers there, and then there's my Suzuki oil filter. So now I'm just going to place the small O-ring over that protruding bit inside the casing. This should just push over it and butt up to it. And here's the large one, and this sits inside the casing. I did give this a clean earlier. I'm just going to make sure all of this is out because I don't want any grit or dirt in there. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now it's time to place this O-ring in there. That's nice. So don't forget, with your arrow facing up, place this over the studs. Now your O-ring is likely to fall out here, because that's just what they do. Okay. Get your nuts whilst holding it firm. Just do that as tight as you can by hand on all of them. That way you know you should have an equal sort of pressure. And then just gently do it until, you know, it won't do up without any pressure. So there we go, that's as far as I'm going. I tap that, that's just stopping, okay? And once you got that, you know they're even, then I'm just going to do a little bit, little bit, little bit, same again. Because these don't need to be done up tight. Now looking back from the front of the bike again, to show you some perspective, that is the original nut we took off to release the oil. Now there's one more thing we can do here. I'm not actually going to do it today, but I'm just going to give you a quick summary of what you would do if you wanted to do it. Under here you can see there's just a Jubilee clip there, and there's a nut just above it. Now if you undo that nut, you need it with a deep socket really. Remove this hose first, pull the nut down, and on the nut there's like a long metal part with a mesh on it. Now that mesh you might find has a few metal filings on it or a bit of debris. You basically just want to clean that off, give it a clean with a rag, push it back in, screw it in and put it back together. Very simple, but it's not necessarily, because I did the oil change last year, I did it then, so not required today. But that's what you'd do if you wanted to. So at the top of the bike, just behind the handlebars, you've got your oil dipstick, and this is where we fill the oil up. So you just want to undo that. The recommended oil for this bike is the 10W40. Now whether or not you use semi-synthetic or fully synthetic is really up to you and what kind of riding you do. I'm going to use the semi-synthetic because that's what I've always used and it's always been fine, but I know some people like to put in the fully synthetic. Now I'm in the UK here, so the recommended amount of oil to go in here in metric is 1.8 litres or 1800 millilitres. Now if you've got two 1 litre bottles, you can more or less pour that out, leave a bit and then sort of play with it once you've checked the oil later. In my case I've got a large tub of oil, so I'm going to measure it out in a little measuring jug first and pour it in from there. And it's always a good idea to use a funnel if you don't want mess all over your bike. And just trickle that in slowly, because if you put it in too quick and you get a bit of an airlock, it's going to come back up all over the bike. So nice and slowly, softly, softly, catchy monkey as they say. And something I should mention is to make sure those plugs are all in at the bottom, otherwise this oil is going straight out on the floor, which is both expensive and messy. So we've left that for a few minutes. I'm just going to put the dipstick in now. Now don't thread this up, just rest it on top of the threads. We'll take it out and check the oil level. I said just rest it on top, don't push it in. Take it out. I would say that's more or less perfect. Now, it's quite difficult to see when your oil's fresh because it's very clear. If in doubt, you can dab it on a nice white clean piece of tissue, and if you dab it you can sort of see how long the line of the oil is. But the best thing to do, if you think it's under, obviously add a bit more. If it's about right, like you think mine is, we're going to take it for a run, leave it, we'll check it later on when we come back. And then also, if it sits in the garage for a week or so and you don't use it, check it before you start the engine again and see if it's a bit low or a bit high. And you should just about get the right amount, because obviously when the engine's warm it's going to show as being a bit higher. When it's settled and all goes to the bottom, it's going to be a bit lower, so you want something in the middle really. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm just going to tighten this up, and I'm going to start the engine before I put the guards back on underneath, and just check everything that we've taken off for leaks. If there's any small leaks, we obviously want to tighten them up. You want to make sure you've got no leaks and everything's okay before we put that on, or otherwise it's coming back off again and you're wasting your time. So that's it, there's no leaks, everything looks fine, so I'm going to put the guard plate back on underneath, and we just do that in the reverse order that we did earlier. So again, using a 10mm socket, I'm just going to guide this in by hand. By just doing them all up by hand like that first, it just gently moves itself into place. If you tighten one up first and then try and do the rest, if it's slightly out of line, what you'll find is you start to strip threads in soft metal like aluminium. So it's worth doing that, and these don't need to be overly tight again. Just always do them like that, so you feel just a nudge, and then I like to one nip like that. Again, like that, nice and soft. There, till I can't go any further, tap, and then one nudge. And the same on the back. Can't go any further, and then one pull. Done. I hope you found this video useful, and for more DIY, how-to, household tips and product review, please watch my other videos and don't forget to subscribe. I've been Pouse around the house. Ta-ta, farewell.